You're well aware that I'm seriously in debt to our employer, as well as having to look after my parents and sister, so that I'm trapped in a difficult situation, but I will work my way out of it again. Please don't make things any harder for me than they are already, and don't take sides against me at the office. I know that nobody likes the travelers. They think we can earn an enormous wage as well as having a soft time of it. That's just the prejudice, but they have no particular reason to think better of it. But you, sir, you have a better overview than the rest of the staff. In fact, if I can say this in confidence, a better overview of the boss himself. It's very easy for a businessman like him to make mistakes about his employees and judge them more harshly than he should. And you're also well aware that we travelers spend almost the whole year away from office, so that we can easily fall victim to the gossip and chance and groundless complaints, and it's almost impossible to defend yourself from that sort of thing. We don't usually hear about them, or even if it's at all when we arrive back home exhausted from a trip, and that's when we feel the harmful effects of what's been going on without even knowing what caused them. Please don't go away. At least first say something to show that you grant that I'm at least partially right. But the chief clerk had turned away as soon as Gregor had started to speak, and with protruding lips only stared back at him over his trembling shoulders as he left. He did not keep still for a moment while Gregor was speaking, but moved steadily towards the door without taking his eyes off him. He moved very gradually, as if there had been some secret prohibition on leaving the room. It was only when he had reached the entrance hall that he made a sudden movement, drew his foot from the living room, and rushed forward in panic. In the hall he stretched his right hand far out towards the stairway, as if out there was some supernatural force waiting to save him. Gregor realized that it was out of question to let the chief clerk go away in this mood if his position in the firm was not to be put in extreme danger. There was something his parents did not understand very well. Over the years they had become convinced that this job would provide Gregor for his entire life, and besides they had so much to worry about at present that they had lost sight of any thought for the future. Gregor, though, did think about the future. The chief clerk had to be held back, calmed down, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family depended on it. If only his sister were here. She was clever. She was already in tears while Gregor was still lying peacefully on his back. And the chief clerk was a lover of women. Sure, she could persuade him. She would close the front door of the entrance hall and ask him out into a shocked state. But his sister was not there. Gregor would have to do the job himself. And without considering that he was still not familiar with how well he could move about in his present state, or that his speech still might not, or probably would not, be understood, he let go of the door, pushed himself through the opening, tried to reach the chief clerk on the landing, who, ridiculously, was holding on to the banister with both hands. But Gregor fell immediately over, and, with a little scream, he sought something to hold on to, landed on his numerous little legs. Hardly had that happened to him then. For the first time in the day, he began to feel all right with his body. The little legs had solid ground under them. To his pleasure, they did exactly as he told them. They were even making the effort to carry him where he wanted to go, and he was soon believing that all his sorrows would soon finally be at an end. He held back the urge to move, but swayed from side to side as he crouched there on the floor. His mother was not far away from him, and seemed, at first, quite engrossed in herself. But then she suddenly jumped with her arms outstretched and her fingers spread, shouting, "Help! For pity's sake, help!" The way she held her head suggested she wanted to see Gregor better, but the unthinking way she was hurrying backward showed that she did not. She had forgotten that the table was behind her with all the breakfast things on it. When she reached the table, she sat down on it without knowing what she was doing, without even screaming to notice that the coffee pot had been knocked over and a gush of coffee was pouring down onto the carpet. "Mother, mother," said Gregor gently, looking up at her. He had completely forgotten the chief clerk for the moment, but he could not help himself snapping to the air with his jaws at the sight of the flow of coffee. That set his mother screaming anew. She fled from the table and into the arms of his father as she rushed toward her. Gregor, though, had no time to spare for his parents now. The chief clerk had already reached the stairs with his chin on the banister. He looked back for the last time. Gregor made a run for him. He wanted to be sure of reaching him. The chief clerk must have expected something, as he leapt down several steps at once and disappeared, his shouts resounding all over the staircase. The flight of the chief clerk seemed, unfortunately, to put Gregor's father into a panic as well. Until then he had been relatively self-controlled, but now instead of running after the clerk himself, or at least not impeding Gregor as he ran toward him, Gregor's father seized the chief clerk's stick in his right hand. The chief clerk left it behind on a chair, along with his hat and overcoat, picked up a large newspaper from the table with his left, and used them to drive Gregor back into his room, stamping his foot at him as he went. Gregor's appeals to his father were of no help. His appeals were simply not understood. However much he humbly turned his head, his father merely stamped his foot all the harder. Across the room, despite the chilly weather, Gregor's mother had pulled open a window, leant far out of it, and pressed her hands to her face. A strong draught of air flew in from the street towards the stairway. The curtains flew up, the newspapers on the table fluttered, and some of them were blown onto the floor. Nothing would stop Gregor's father as he drove them back, making hissing noises at him like a wild man. Gregor had never had any practice in moving backwards, and this was the only way to go very slowly. If Gregor had only been allowed to turn around, he would have been back in his room straight away, but he was afraid that if he took the time to do that, his father would become impatient. There was a threat of a lethal blow to his back or head from the stick in his father's hand at any moment. Eventually, though, Gregor realized that he had no choice, as he saw to his disgust, that he was quite incapable of going backwards in a straight line. So he began, as quickly as possible, and with frequent anxious glances at his father, to turn himself around. It went very slowly, but perhaps his father was able to see his good intentions, as he did nothing to hinder him. In fact, now and then he used the tip of his stick to give directions from a distance as to which way to turn. If only his father would stop that unbearable hissing. It was making Gregor quite confused. When he had nearly finished turning around, still listening to that hissing, he made a mistake and turned himself back a little the way he had just come. He was pleased when he finally had his head in front of the doorway, but then saw that it was too narrow, and his body was too broad to get through it without further difficulty. In his present mood, it obviously did not occur to his father to open the door so that Gregor would have enough space to get through. He was merely fixed on the idea that Gregor should have gotten back into his room as quickly as possible, nor would he ever have allowed Gregor the time to get himself upright as preparation for getting through the doorway. What he did, making more noise than ever, was to drive Gregor forwards all the harder, as if there had been nothing in the way. It sounded to Gregor as if there was now more than one father behind him. It was not a pleasant experience, and Gregor pushed himself into the doorway without regard to what might happen. One side of his body lifted itself. He lay at an angle in the doorway, one flank scraped on the white door and was painfully injured, leaving vile brown flecks on it. Soon he was stuck fast, and he would not have been able to move at all by himself. The little legs along one side hung quiveringly in the air, while those on the other side were pressed painfully to the ground. Then his father gave him a hefty shove from behind, which released him from where he was held and sent him flying, and heavy bleeding, deep into his room. The door slammed shut with a stick, and then finally all was quiet.